Deputy Luke Bennett had seen many things in his years of service, but nothing prepared him for what he found that cold Tennessee morning. In the shadow of the old chapel at Hollow Creek, a German shepherd hung from a wooden cross, blood frozen on its fur, its eyes still open, not with rage, but with a plea for mercy. Someone had nailed a sign above its head that read, "Cursed by God." When Luke cut the dog down, it was still breathing, barely. The townsfolk whispered that this was the devil's animal, the one that appeared before every death in the valley. But Luke saw something else. Not a curse, but a creature of pain and faith, a survivor of cruelty. As he dug deeper, he uncovered a web of fear, lies, and madness that would shake the very heart of Hollow Creek. Because behind the mask of holiness, one man's twisted grief had turned into a reign of terror. And only the dog everyone feared would lead Luke to the truth. What happens next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The winter dawn in Hollow Creek, Tennessee was gray and merciless, a thin mist crawling through the trees like breath from an unseen mouth. Snow clung stubbornly to the dirt roads, half melted by the weak sun, and the church bell, long silent, hung crooked over the old chapel at the edge of the forest. Deputy Luke Bennett, 35, adjusted the collar of his dark sheriff's jacket as he stepped out of his patrol car. A former Marine turned lawman, Luke carried the quiet air of a man who had seen too much and said too little. His steel-gray eyes scanned the fog, his boots crunching over the icy gravel as he made his way toward the gathering of townsfolk near the chapel fence. They huddled together in the cold, farmers, lumbermen, and old widows clutching rosaries, faces pale with fear. The whispers cut through the wind like brittle twigs. "It's the cursed dog again," an elderly woman murmured. "Same one from last winter. That's why people keep dying." Luke frowned. "Step back, everyone. Nobody goes inside until I say so." From the group, an old man stepped forward, his shoulders hunched beneath a tattered brown coat. His name was Earl Mathers, 68, a retired miner whose shaking hands betrayed both age and fear. "Deputy, you don't want to go in there," he warned. "We heard it scream, I swear to you, like a soul in hell itself." Luke looked past him toward the chapel. The heavy wooden doors were cracked open, swaying slightly in the wind. A low, guttural sound drifted through the gap, half growl, half cry. He rested his hand on his holstered pistol, though something deep inside told him it wouldn't help here. "I'll check it out," Luke said firmly. "Everyone stay back." He pushed the doors open. The hinges groaned like a dying man. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sharp metallic scent of blood. The chapel was dim, its windows shattered, letting in thin slices of pale light. Snowflakes drifted in through the broken panes, melting on the warped wooden floorboards. Then Luke froze. At the far end, where the altar once stood, something hung on a crude wooden cross. A German shepherd, large, sable and black, its body limp, fur matted with blood. The dog's chest still rose and fell weakly, a faint tremor of life. The sight hit Luke like a blow. He dropped his flashlight, breath catching in his throat. Pinned to the base of the cross was a weathered piece of paper. Written in black ink, the words read, "Cursed by God." For a long moment, Luke couldn't move. The air seemed to thicken, and the silence pressed against his ears. He had seen cruelty in war, but this was something else, something twisted. "Jesus Christ," he whispered under his breath. He approached slowly, his boots echoing across the floor. The dog's eyes flickered open, one brown, one clouded gray, and locked onto his. There was no aggression, no fear, only pain and a strange pleading, understanding. "Easy now," Luke said quietly, voice softening. "You're all right. I got you." He unclipped the small hunting knife from his belt and began cutting the ropes that held the animal's legs. The coarse fibers had bitten deep into its flesh. When he freed the last knot, the dog collapsed into his arms with a low whimper. "Hang on, boy," Luke murmured, pulling off his jacket and wrapping it around the trembling body. "You're gonna make it." A sound behind him made him turn. The townsfolk had followed, peering through the open doorway. Fear and a superstition gleamed in their eyes. "It's the cursed one!" a young man shouted. "That thing brought death last time. Don't touch it, deputy!" Luke's gaze hardened. "No one touches this dog," he said sharply. "Not a soul. It's coming with me." An older woman, her face lined and pale, clutched her Bible tighter. "Deputy Bennett, you don't understand. That animal appeared every time someone died. First the Miller girl, then the Andersons' baby. It's marked by evil." Luke shook his head. "No. What's marked here isn't the dog. It's whoever did this." He carried the shepherd toward the exit, his arms straining under its weight. As he stepped into the cold air, the villagers parted like he was walking through a graveyard. Some crossed themselves, others turned away. Earl Mathers called after him, voice trembling. "You can't save what's been damned, son." Luke ignored him. He laid the dog gently in the back seat of his patrol car, tucking the jacket tighter around it. The animal's breathing was shallow, but steady. Its fur was rough, scarred along the neck, proof that this cruelty wasn't the first it had suffered. He glanced at the sign hanging over the chapel door. The wooden cross creaked in the wind, the words "Cursed by God" swaying like a false sermon. As Luke slid behind the wheel, he whispered to himself, "If God's watching, he'll know this isn't the cursed one." He started the engine. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent, covering the blood-stained ground as he drove toward the Hollow Creek Veterinary Clinic. Behind him, the townsfolk watched until his taillights disappeared into the white distance. The wind carried their murmurs away, leaving only the empty chapel and the echo of the dog's fading cry, like a soul refusing to be forgotten. Snow fell in thin, slanted streaks across the darkened streets of Hollow Creek as Deputy Luke Bennett pulled his patrol truck up to the small wooden building that doubled as both the town's veterinary clinic and animal shelter. The sign above the door read, "Clara Whitmore, DVM." Paint faded and half hidden by icicles. The soft hum of fluorescent lights flickered through the windows. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and hay clung to the air. Dr. Clara Whitmore, 30 years old, tall and graceful with auburn hair tied in a loose bun, glanced up from the examination table as Luke stepped in. She wore a faded green scrub shirt under a heavy wool cardigan, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. A streak of fatigue traced her face, the kind that comes from both long hours and a heavy heart. She had left a big city clinic 2 years earlier after losing her younger sister to a hit-and-run in Nashville, something the police never solved. Since then, she'd buried herself in work, mending broken creatures that couldn't tell lies. Luke carried the unconscious German shepherd in his arms wrapped in his sheriff's jacket. The dog's breathing was faint but steady. Clara's eyes widened. "Good Lord, what happened to him?" "He was strung up in the old chapel by the ridge," Luke said, voice low. "Somebody thought it'd be fun to play executioner." Clara's expression hardened. "Set him here." Luke laid the dog gently on the metal table. The light caught the scars across its neck, deep, precise, almost surgical. Clara inhaled sharply. "These aren't random injuries. Whoever did this, they wanted him to suffer." She moved with calm precision, her gloved hands checking vitals, pulse, reflexes. "He's dehydrated, malnourished, but he's fighting to live." Luke stood quietly beside her, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline that hadn't yet faded. "He didn't even try to bite when I cut him down," he said softly. "Just looked at me, like he was asking if I'd help." Clara glanced up, her green eyes softening. "Animals know who means harm and who doesn't. Maybe he saw something good left in you." Luke gave a dreamy half-smile. "Let's hope he's right." The German shepherd twitched, a low sound rumbling in its throat. Its eyelids fluttered open, revealing mismatched eyes, one amber, one pale gray, clouded from an old injury. It tried to rise, but Clara placed a firm hand on its shoulder. "Easy, boy. You're safe now." The dog stared between them, uncertain, its breathing quick and shallow. Luke extended a gloved hand slowly. "Hey there, partner. Nobody's gonna hurt you anymore." The dog flinched but didn't bare its teeth. It simply looked at him, long, steady, as though searching for truth in the human standing before it. Then, slowly, it lowered its head onto the blanket. Clara exhaled. That's trust. Hard-earned, but trust all the same. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Luke looked toward the frosted window and saw movement across the street. A group of townsfolk gathered near the diner, whispering, pointing toward the clinic. He recognized the face of Earl Mathers among them. The old miner was muttering something to two younger men, shaking his head grimly. Clara followed Luke's gaze. They're talking about the dog, aren't they? Luke nodded. Word travels fast in small towns. They think he's cursed, right? Yeah. Said he shows up before people die. The devil's hound, they're calling him now. Luke's tone carried bitterness. Superstition's got sharper teeth than reason. Clara straightened up, wiping her hands. People fear what they don't understand, but fear doesn't make them right. Luke gave her a look, half grateful, half weary. You're the only one in this town who hasn't tried to stop me from helping him. Maybe because I've seen what cruelty looks like, she said quietly, and what redemption can do. A moment of silence passed, filled only by the steady tick of the wall clock and the hum of the heater. Clara began cleaning the wounds carefully, stitching the deeper cuts. Luke watched in silence, occasionally handing her gauze or antiseptic when she asked. The dog whimpered softly, but didn't fight. You should give him a name, she said after a while. Luke thought for a moment. How about Shadow? Seems like he's been living in one for a while. Clara smiled faintly. Shadow it is. When the treatment was finished, Shadow lay wrapped in blankets under a heat lamp, breathing evenly for the first time since they found him. Luke pulled a chair near the table and sat, resting his elbows on his knees. You can go home, Deputy, Clara said gently. He'll make it through the night. I'll stay with him. Luke shook his head. I'll stay too. He's already had enough people walk out on him. Hours passed. The snow thickened outside, cloaking the world in quiet white. At one point, Shadow stirred, his head lifting weakly to look at Luke again. Their eyes met, one pair human, one wounded, but still burning with defiance. Clara watched the exchange from her desk, her heart tightening. She saw something in Luke she hadn't noticed before. Loneliness, yes, but also a kind of fierce loyalty that mirrored the dog's own. Near dawn, the front door creaked open. Earl Mathers stepped in, hat in hand, flanked by two other townsmen. Their faces were drawn and uneasy. Deputy, Earl began, voice quivering. You can't keep that creature here. The town's already lost too many good souls since it came around. Luke stood slowly, his shadow stretching across the room. You really think killing a half-dead dog will fix your problems, Earl? You weren't here the last times, Earl snapped, fear overtaking reason. Every family that saw it, gone within days. We ain't risking it again. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. This dog isn't your curse. It's a victim. The only curse in this town is ignorance. Earl looked between them, then spat on the floor and turned to leave. You'll regret it when another one dies. The door slammed shut, leaving only silence and the faint sound of wind. Luke rubbed his temples, exhaustion pressing down. They won't stop talking. Clara nodded. Then give them something else to talk about. Find out where he came from. Maybe the truth will quiet them. Luke looked back at Shadow, who was now asleep again, chest rising and falling steadily. Yeah, he murmured. Maybe the truth's the only thing that can. He turned off the overhead light, leaving only the glow of the heater illuminating the small clinic. Outside, the town was still whispering about curses. Inside, a man and a wounded dog had found a fragile truce, one built not on faith or fear, but something far stronger, and for the first time that night, Luke felt a strange sense of peace, as though somewhere above the storm, God had decided to give Hollow Creek one more chance. Morning came pale and slow over Hollow Creek, painting the frost-coated rooftops in thin layers of gold. The storm had passed, but the town still held its breath. Even the birds seemed quieter. Inside the sheriff's small wooden office, Deputy Luke Bennett sat hunched over a cluttered desk, a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside stacks of old case files. The heater rattled weakly in the corner, doing little to chase away the cold. Luke's uniform jacket hung over the back of his chair, revealing a gray flannel shirt rolled at the sleeves. His eyes, bloodshot from lack of sleep, flicked across faded crime scene photos. All of them told the same story. Families struck by sudden poisoning. Different homes, different months, always the same ending. The victims' faces stared up at him from the photographs. The Miller family, the Andersons, the Dawsons. All locals, all good people. And in every report, there was one chilling similarity. Each household had a little girl. Luke rubbed the bridge of his nose and muttered, "What the hell is happening in this town?" He flipped open the last folder, dated 3 weeks ago. Case 221 HC. Dawson family. Cause of death, food contamination, lethal dose of pesticide detected. Evidence inconclusive. Witness accounts, none. But what caught his attention was a note at the bottom, written in the sheriff's handwriting. German shepherd found near property, covered in ash. Locals report dog howling before discovery of bodies. He sat back, the memory of that night in the chapel flashing before his eyes, the same breed, the same aura of sorrow. "Shadow," he whispered. The office door creaked open. Clara Whitmore stepped inside, brushing snow from her coat. She wore a thick gray scarf and carried a small folder under her arm. Despite the cold, her presence warmed the room. "Morning, Deputy," she said softly. "I brought the lab results you asked for." Luke gestured for her to sit. "You didn't have to come out in this weather." Clara smiled faintly. "You didn't seem like the type who'd wait for an email." She opened the folder, revealing printed charts. "The chemicals we found on Shadow's fur, it's the same compound found in the victim's autopsy reports. Rat poison. But here's the strange part. It's not a brand you can buy in any store around here. This is industrial grade." Luke frowned. "Meaning someone got it through private channels." "Exactly." He leaned back, thinking. And Shadow had traces of it on him. Maybe from the soil where he was tied up. Or maybe from wherever it was stored. Clara hesitated, watching him closely. "Luke, if what you're thinking is true, then someone's been spreading that poison deliberately." He nodded slowly. "And they've been letting everyone believe it's the dog." Before Clara could respond, the bell above the office door jingled again. An old man stepped inside, tapping his way carefully with a wooden cane. His beard was white and uneven, his face weathered like cracked bark. His left eye was clouded over with blindness. "Jacob," Luke greeted, standing. "Didn't expect to see you out this early." Jacob Price, 72, had lived in Hollow Creek longer than anyone could remember. Once a carpenter, he'd lost his sight in a sawmill accident decades ago, but was known for having a sharp tongue and a memory like a ledger. He wore a heavy wool coat, patched and frayed, and a cross pendant hung from his neck, worn smooth from years of touch. "Morning, Deputy," Jacob rasped, removing his hat. "Heard you found the cursed dog." Luke exchanged a quick glance with Clara. "Yeah, we're looking after him. Why?" Jacob tilted his head, his unseeing eyes clouded but focused in direction of Luke's voice. "Because that dog ain't cursed. He's seen what others haven't. That animal was always around because he could smell what was buried where it shouldn't be." Luke frowned. "What do you mean, buried?" The old man's lips trembled slightly. "Last summer, I was walking near the back of Reverend Hale's chapel. You know, the one the storm nearly took down. I heard shoveling. Soft, careful, too late for anyone honest to be out digging. I called out, but the Reverend said he was burying holy things. Didn't sound holy to me. Earth didn't settle right afterward. Never does when something wrong's underneath it." Clara leaned forward. "Are you sure it was Reverend Hale?" Jacob nodded. "I may not have eyes, but I know that man's voice. Heard him preaching since before you were born, miss." Luke exhaled slowly. Reverend Samuel Hale was one of the most respected men in town, a man of God, revered and feared in equal measure. "Did you tell anyone?" Jacob gave a humorless chuckle. "Who'd listen to a blind old fool? They'd sooner burn the dog again than question the preacher." He tapped his cane against the floor. "Something evil's rooted in that ground, son. You can feel it if you stand still long enough." Before Luke could press further, the radio on his desk crackled to life. "Dispatch to Unit 3. Report of a dead animal found near the Dawson property. Locals request investigation." Luke reached for his hat. "I'll handle it." He turned to Clara. "You stay with Shadow. Make sure no one gets near him. If the town's this scared, someone might try to finish what they started." Clara nodded firmly. "I'll watch him like a hawk." Jacob gripped Luke's sleeve as he passed. "Deputy," he whispered, voice trembling, "whatever's buried behind that chapel, it ain't dead yet." Luke left the station, his truck tires crunching over snow as he drove toward the outskirts of town. The landscape was eerily still, the trees skeletal against the pale sky. The Dawson property sat empty now, the windows boarded, a child's swing frozen mid-sway in the yard. He crouched, near the fence, spotting what the call had mentioned, a raccoon, lifeless, foam around its mouth. Beside it, the snow was stained green where something had spilled, a chemical residue that stung his nose. He scraped a sample into a vial, frowning. Someone was poisoning the ground itself. He looked up toward the distant ridge where the old chapel stood, its steeple black against the lightening sky. A shape moved briefly near its side, a shadow against the snow. Luke's breath caught. It was Reverend Hale, his long black coat flowing in the wind, shovel in hand. He was digging again. Luke climbed back into his truck, his pulse quickening. "You were right, Jacob," he muttered under his breath. "The ground's not done talking." He turned the ignition and drove toward the ridge, the chapel cross growing larger in the windshield. Somewhere deep in the woods, the faint sound of a dog's howl rose and fell with the wind. A cry not of fear, but of warning. The drive up to Hollow Creek Chapel took Luke Bennett through winding roads lined with frost-covered pines and silent, watching fields. The chapel sat on a hill like a ghost of better days, its white paint peeling, its bell tower leaning slightly, and its cross catching the pale winter sun like a blade. The closer Luke got, the more uneasy he felt. The building had once been the soul of the town. Now it looked like its grave. He parked his patrol truck at the foot of the hill and stepped out, snow crunching under his boots. The air smelled faintly of smoke and old pine tar. From inside the chapel he heard the creak of floorboards and the low murmur of someone praying. When he opened the heavy door, a rush of cold air swept through the narrow aisles. Reverend Samuel Hale was at the pulpit, hunched forward in fervent whisper. He was in his late 50s, tall but stooped, with silver hair slicked back and a gaunt, pale face carved by sleepless nights. His black clerical coat looked immaculate, pressed and spotless, though his hands trembled slightly when he clasped them together. A small wooden cross hung at his chest, polished from obsessive handling. "Reverend," Luke said, his voice steady but guarded. Hale turned slowly, his expression calm, yet strangely distant. "Deputy Bennett," he said with a faint smile, "I was expecting you sooner or later. The Lord said truth always walks in the cold." Luke closed the door behind him. "I'm here about the dog, the one found at the old chapel." The Reverend's smile didn't fade. "Ah, the cursed beast. You freed it, didn't you?" Luke's jaw tightened. "I did. And I'd like to understand why someone thought hanging it like a criminal was the right thing to do." Hale stepped down from the altar, his boots echoing softly on the worn wooden floor. "Sometimes mercy looks like cruelty, Deputy. You see, that creature was not just an animal, it was a sign, a message from God himself." Luke frowned. "A message?" "Yes." The Reverend's eyes, a cold gray blue, glimmered with something both sorrowful and fanatical. "My daughter, Evelyn, was taken from me 2 summers ago, bitten by a dog that had gone mad. We prayed, we bled, we begged, but she died in my arms. The doctors called it infection. I call it punishment." For a moment, silence fell. The faint light through the stained windows painted his face in fractured colors, red, blue, gold, like the pieces of a shattered soul. Hale continued, voice rising with quiet fervor. "Ever since that night, dogs have appeared before every tragedy in this town. Before the Millers fell ill, one stood in their yard. Before the Dawsons died, another prowled their porch. They are not just animals, Deputy. They are omens, messengers of death. And this one, the German shepherd you saved, it was the worst of them all." Luke took a slow step forward. "You're saying God is using them to punish people?" "I'm saying God warns us, and we refuse to listen." The tone was so certain, so absolute, that it sent a chill down Luke's spine. He studied Hale more closely, the way his eyes flickered, the tremor in his fingers. There was grief there, yes, but also obsession. Luke's gaze shifted to the side wall of the chapel. Something caught his attention, a locked door partially hidden by a crimson curtain. Hale followed his eyes, his tone hardening. "That's a private prayer room, Deputy, not for the unfaithful." "I'm not here to pray," Luke said evenly. "I'm here to make sure no one else gets hurt." The Reverend's lips curved into something between a smile and a sneer. "Hurt? You think pain is always evil? Christ suffered on the cross, and from that suffering came salvation. Perhaps the same must be done here." Luke held his stare for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Mind if I take a look around before I go?" "Of course," Hale said softly, gesturing to the pews. "The Lord's house is open, but remember, truth can burn." Luke began to walk slowly through the chapel, boots echoing on the old wood. He stopped near a small alcove lined with candles. Their flames flickered beneath a collection of framed photographs. He leaned closer. The images sent a jolt through him. Dozens of dogs, different breeds, ages, each one bound or nailed to wooden crosses, their eyes empty, their bodies scarred. Under each frame, a handwritten label, "Purified by Faith." Luke's pulse quickened. He felt the sting of bile in his throat. He turned sharply. "What is this, Reverend?" Hale stood still, his hands folded calmly behind his back. "A reminder," he said softly, "that evil takes many forms, Deputy. Some walk on 2 legs, some on 4. "This isn't faith," Luke said, his voice low and shaking. "This is murder." The Reverend's eyes flashed with something dark. "You call it murder. I call it redemption." Luke took a step closer, his tone now sharp. "Did you hang that German shepherd, Reverend?" For the first time, Hale's composure cracked. His lips twitched, his pupils narrowing. "It was already cursed. I merely helped it fulfill its purpose." Luke clenched his fists, every instinct screaming to arrest him on the spot, but without proof, he couldn't. Not yet. He turned toward the door, his voice steady. "You said your daughter died of a dog bite. I'm sorry for that. But whatever you're doing now, it isn't healing you. It's twisting you." The Reverend's smile returned, slow and eerie. "Perhaps that's what faith is, Deputy. Twisted wood, bearing holy weight." Luke walked out, the door slamming behind him. The cold hit him like a slap, but he welcomed it. It cleared his head. He stood for a long time, staring up at the steeple, where the cross seemed to lean just slightly to the left, as if even it was tired of the burden it bore. Back in his truck, he jotted notes into his pad. "Reverend Hale, unstable, possible religious delusion, photographs of animal mutilation, needs deeper investigation." He looked once more at the chapel in the rearview mirror. The stained glass windows glowed faintly from within, their light trembling like dying embers. In the distance, from the direction of the clinic, a faint howl rose through the morning air. Shadow's voice, steady and low, like a warning carried on the wind. And Luke knew, deep down, that the man who claimed to serve God might just be the one summoning hell. The storm rolled in quietly that night, swallowing Hollow Creek under a curtain of freezing rain. Wind howled against the windows of the small veterinary outpost on the edge of town where Clara Matthews was finishing her last round of treatments. The clock above the medicine cabinet read 11:47 p.m., and the world outside had turned to liquid shadow. Clara, a woman in her early 30s with auburn hair tied in a low braid and tired eyes that had seen too much for her age, worked in silence. Her white coat was flecked with iodine stains, her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she cleaned surgical tools. The faint hum of a radio whispered gospel music through the quiet clinic, but even through the melody, she felt it. That eerie stillness, that weight in the air that told her something was watching. Shadow lay nearby on a worn blanket, his bandaged flank rising and falling steadily as he rested. His wounds were healing fast, but his eyes, deep amber pools, stayed fixed on the door. Every few seconds his ears twitched toward the sound of the wind outside, the creak of the roof. Clara sighed softly, reaching for a mug of coffee gone cold. "It's just the storm, boy," she whispered, trying to convince herself as much as him. The clinic lights flickered once, twice, and then held steady. Somewhere in the back, a metal tray clattered to the floor. She froze. Shadow stood instantly, low growl rumbling in his chest. His body went rigid, muscles tensed. "Hello?" Clara called, her voice trembling. "Who's there?" No answer, only the soft, deliberate creak of a door hinge. She stepped back slowly, reaching for the flashlight on her desk. Before she could turn it on, the back door burst open, slamming against the wall. A figure in dark clothes lunged toward her, the gleam of a blade catching the dim light. Clara screamed. But before the sound fully left her throat, Shadow was already moving. He launched forward with a snarl that split the silence, his teeth sinking into the attacker's arm. The man cursed, stumbling backward as the dog's powerful jaws tore fabric and flesh. "Shadow, no!" Clara cried. But the shepherd didn't stop. He was defending her with a fury born of pain and instinct. The attacker wrenched free, tearing his sleeve in the process. He swung wildly at the dog, nicking its shoulder, then bolted through the rain-soaked doorway into the dark. For a moment, the only sounds were the growl of thunder and the heavy rhythm of Clara's heartbeat. Shadow limped toward her, blood streaking his side, a torn piece of black cloth hanging from his teeth. Clara dropped to her knees beside him, trembling hands tracing his wounds. "Oh, God. Shadow, you saved my life." Her fingers brushed the fabric caught in his teeth, and she froze. It was thick, fine wool, black, with a single white thread stitched in a small, familiar pattern. She held it up to the light, and her stomach turned cold. It was part of a clerical robe. When Luke arrived 20 minutes later, the rain had turned to sleet. His patrol truck's lights illuminated the clinic's porch, where Clara stood waiting, wrapped in a blanket. Her hands shook as she handed him the torn cloth sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Luke, tall and broad-shouldered in his dark sheriff's jacket, took the bag carefully. His gray eyes flicked from Clara to Shadow, then back again. "You said the man came from behind the clinic?" Clara nodded, her voice barely steady. "Yes, I didn't see his face, but he wore gloves. Black. And this robe. Shadow bit him, Luke. Hard. There'll be a wound." Luke glanced at the dog who lay nearby with one ear perked and a quiet defiance in his gaze. "Then we'll find him. And he'll have to explain why a priest's cloth ended up in your clinic." For a moment, they stood in silence as the storm rattled the roof. Then Clara sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Luke crouched beside her. "You okay?" She nodded, then hesitated. "Luke, there's something I never told anyone, about why I stayed in Hollow Creek after everyone else left." He listened, leaning forward slightly. "My little sister, Emily, she died here, 2 years ago. They said it was food poisoning, but I know it wasn't. It started the same week Reverend Hale came back from his sabbatical, and the dog, Shadow, he was there that night." Luke's eyes narrowed. "You're saying Shadow found her?" Clara looked up, tears streaking her cheeks. "Yes, he was outside our house, howling. I thought he was trying to warn us, but when people saw him, they said he was cursed. Hale said it too. He told my parents the dog brought death wherever it went." She swallowed hard. "That's when my father sent Shadow away. A week later, our well water tested positive for toxins, the same thing that killed Emily." Luke rubbed a hand over his jaw, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. So, every family that lost a child had been told by Hale that a dog was seen nearby, she finished. He made them believe it was punishment, when really, Luke said darkly, he was using superstition to cover his crimes. Outside, thunder rolled again, low and heavy. Shadow's ears perked up as Luke stood and walked to the window. The rain was easing, but a mist had begun to crawl along the ground, thick as smoke. The world outside looked almost spectral, like the town itself was holding its breath. Luke turned back to Clara. "You need protection. He'll know Shadow bit him. He'll try again." "I'll be fine," she said softly. "You can't watch both of us." He gave a small smile. "Try me." Clara met his eyes, and for a brief second, beneath the fear and exhaustion, there was something unspoken, gratitude, maybe even trust. Luke knelt beside Shadow and ran a gloved hand along his neck. The dog didn't flinch this time. Instead, he pressed his head gently into Luke's palm, a gesture of wordless understanding. "You did good tonight," Luke murmured. "Real good." The German shepherd's tail brushed weakly against the floor. As Luke stood to leave, the torn piece of clerical cloth caught his eye again, lying on the table under the clinic light. For the first time, the truth seemed closer than ever, but darker than he could have imagined. He tucked the evidence bag into his coat pocket and looked back at Clara. "Lock your doors and keep the lights on." When he stepped outside, the storm had passed, leaving the town washed clean but uneasy. In the reflection of the wet street, the church steeple loomed tall and crooked against the sky. Luke could almost hear Hale's voice from their last conversation. "Truth can burn." Maybe so, he thought grimly, but he was ready to burn everything down to find it. The night hung thick over Hollow Creek like a shroud of smoke. The moon was little more than a pale blur behind rolling clouds, and the air smelled faintly of rain and pine rot. Deputy Luke Bennett moved silently through the back of the churchyard, his flashlight beam slicing through the mist. Shadow padded beside him, paws silent against the wet ground, nose low to the earth. The world was quiet except for the faint creak of the chapel's old sign swaying in the wind. It was nearly midnight, the hour when the living slept and the dead remembered. Luke had followed Shadow's sudden agitation, the way the dog had whined at the clinic door and bolted out toward the forest behind the church. Now, after half an hour of tracking, they stood before the old graveyard, forgotten by most, feared by all. The fence was broken in several places, its iron spikes eaten by rust. The headstones that still stood were cracked or leaning, some swallowed by weeds. But, farther in, where the fog thickened, Luke noticed something strange. A row of small, freshly turned mounds of earth. No names, no carvings, only numbers written on wooden stakes, 1 through 7. He crouched beside one, brushing the snow from its surface. The dirt was still soft, recently disturbed. "Good boy," Luke murmured to Shadow. "You found something." The shepherd stood still, his ears perked, his breath forming white clouds in the air. Then he began to dig, paws striking the earth in steady rhythm, as if he already knew where to go. Luke pulled on his gloves and joined in. It didn't take long. Just a few inches beneath the soil, his fingers struck glass. He scraped the dirt aside and lifted out a small jar, sealed with a metal cap. Inside, a pale liquid shimmered faintly under the light. Luke frowned. "What the hell?" He shook it gently. The sound was faint, like sand shifting inside water. It wasn't blood. It wasn't oil. He slipped it into a plastic bag and zipped it shut. Shadow let out a low growl, turning his head toward the chapel. Luke followed his gaze. For a moment he thought he saw a figure, a tall man standing among the crosses, a dark silhouette watching them. But when the beam of his flashlight hit, there was nothing, just gravestones and fog. "Come on," Luke whispered. "We're done here." Back at the clinic, Clara was waiting in her lab coat, her hair tied up hastily, face pale from exhaustion. The old fluorescent light buzzed overhead as Luke laid the evidence bag on the metal table. "I need you to test this," he said quietly. She raised an eyebrow. "You dug something up in the middle of the night again, didn't you?" "Graveyard behind the church," Luke replied. 7 unmarked mounds. This was buried under one. Clara carefully opened the bag and lifted the jar with gloved hands. The chemical smell hit instantly. Sharp, metallic, and bitter. "This is industrial grade," she murmured. "Not something people just buy at the store." Luke watched her move around the small lab, mixing reagents, lighting the Bunsen burner. Shadow lay on the floor by the door, his head resting on his paws, eyes following her every move. After several minutes, Clara straightened up, her expression grim. "Rodenticide, high concentration. If this got into the water or food, it would cause organ failure within minutes." Luke's throat tightened. "Same toxin that killed your sister?" "Yes." Her voice was quiet, but steady. Almost identical chemical signature. He exhaled slowly. "Can you get fingerprints from the cap?" Clara nodded, reaching for the black dusting powder. "Give me a few minutes." Luke paced the room, the hum of the equipment filling the silence. His mind raced. The graves, the jars, the missing girls, every thread seemed to lead back to the same man in the black coat. When Clara finally spoke, her voice was trembling. "Luke, you need to see this." He turned. Under the harsh light, the cap sat on the table, a fingerprint clearly visible in the powder. Clara had already compared it on her computer against the local database. The name flashed on screen in bold white letters. Hale, Samuel. Luke's pulse quickened. "You're sure?" "Absolutely. There's no mistake." He stared at the screen, the edges of his vision blurring with a rush of anger. He buried poison, not bodies, evidence. Clara nodded, rubbing her temple. "He's been hiding the source of the contamination all along. Those graves probably contain jars like this, not victims." Luke clenched his jaw. "And the town still thinks he's their shepherd." She looked up at him, her eyes full of worry. "Luke, you can't go after him alone. Not yet. He's protected. Half the town still goes to his sermons." "I'm not going after him," Luke said quietly. "I'm going after proof." He picked up the jar, holding it against the light. If he's been dosing families himself, then every grave back there might be a confession waiting to be found. Clara swallowed hard. "Then let me help." Luke shook his head. "You already have, but I need you to stay somewhere safe. He knows Shadow bit him, and if he finds out what we've discovered—" Her voice softened. "He'll come for me." He nodded once. "And for him," he said, glancing at Shadow. The dog's ears perked at his name, and for a fleeting second the tension in the room broke. Luke crouched, resting a hand on the shepherd's neck. "You led me there tonight, didn't you? You knew where to look." Shadow pressed closer to his knee, tail barely moving, eyes deep with something that looked like knowing. Luke stood again, the weight of his next move heavy in his chest. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "we go back to that graveyard. All of it needs to be dug up." Clara reached for his arm. "Be careful. The last man who questioned Hale ended up leaving town. Overnight. No one's heard from him since." Luke gave her a faint, tired smile. "Then I'll make sure they hear from me." He tucked the jar into a padded evidence case and headed for the door. The wind had picked up again outside, shaking the clinic windows. Before leaving, he turned back. "Lock the doors, Clara. Keep Shadow with you until morning." As he stepped into the night, Shadow whined softly, but obeyed when Clara held his collar. The deputy disappeared into the storm, his figure swallowed by the dark. Back at the old graveyard, the fog thickened once more, curling over the numbered mounds like fingers. And far above, the chapel bell swayed slowly in the wind, though no one had touched it for years. The dawn came gray and cold over Hollow Creek, its first light struggling through the fog that clung to the hills. Deputy Luke Bennett stood outside the chapel, steam rising from his breath as he waited for the locks to be opened. His fingers tightened around the handle of his revolver, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. The door creaked open after several knocks. Reverend Samuel Hale stood in the frame, his black coat buttoned to the throat, his face calm, almost serene. But Luke could see it now. Beneath that calm, the faint twitch of guilt, the exhaustion of a man who'd been living with a ghost. "Deputy Bennett," Hale said softly, "you're up early." "So are you," Luke replied. "Mind if I come in?" Hale stepped aside, gesturing to the pews. "God's house is open to all, even those who come armed." Inside, the chapel was dim, smelling of candle wax and old dust. A faint melody played from a small record player on the altar, an old hymn about repentance. Luke turned it off. "I'm not here for a sermon," he said. "I'm here for answers." Hale smiled faintly, his eyes distant. "Then you've come to the wrong place. Answers belong to God." Luke took a slow step closer. "You buried jars behind your chapel, poison jars. I dug them up. Found your fingerprints on one. You want to tell me why?" The Reverend's lips trembled slightly, then pressed into a thin line. He walked toward the stained glass window depicting Christ holding a lamb. "Sin spreads like rot, Deputy. You can't just cover it with mercy. You have to burn it out." Luke's voice hardened. "You didn't burn sin, Reverend. You poisoned children. You killed families." The man's hands clenched behind his back. "They were not innocent," he whispered. "They lived in corruption, lies, greed, blasphemy. They brought their punishment upon themselves." Luke slammed his fist onto the pew rail. "You think killing them was God's will?" Hale turned sharply, his face pale, eyes wild. "He spoke to me," he hissed. "That night, when my Amelia died. I heard him. I felt him. He said, 'Cleanse the earth of the cursed seed, and you will save others from her fate.'" For a long moment, silence filled the chapel. Only the wind outside pressed against the windows. Luke took a breath, steady but sharp. "So, you started killing families that had daughters. You thought you were saving the world from losing another Amelia." The Reverend's shoulders sagged, his voice trembling with conviction. "I was saving their souls. The pain I bore was holy." Luke's tone dropped, almost a whisper. "You didn't just kill people, Reverend. You tortured their faith. You made them believe the devil lived in a dog." At that, Hale's expression changed. Something between pain and rage flickered across his face. "That dog," he spat. "You speak of it as if it's pure, but it's not. It's a beast born of death." Luke stepped closer. "You mean Shadow?" The Reverend's breathing quickened. "That monster belonged to Amelia. She loved it more than anything. She said it talked to her, that it warned her about the sickness coming. I told her it was a lie, temptation from the serpent himself, but she didn't listen." His voice cracked. "When she died, that creature stayed by her grave for days, wouldn't leave. I could still hear it howling at night, calling for her soul. I knew then it had been marked. The curse had to be broken." Luke's stomach twisted as the truth took shape. "So, you hung it on the cross," he said quietly. "You crucified your daughter's dog and called it redemption." Hale's eyes shone with tears, but they weren't of remorse. "I freed her from its shadow," he whispered. "I gave her peace." Luke's hand itched toward his belt, not for his gun, but for his cuffs. "You didn't free anyone, Reverend. You just buried your guilt in the name of God." The Reverend looked up suddenly, his gaze burning with feverish conviction. "You don't understand, Deputy. I was chosen. I was told to continue her work. Each time a girl was born, I saw her face in the child's eyes, the curse repeating. I couldn't let that happen." Luke's heart pounded. "You poisoned them because you thought you were saving Amelia again." Hale nodded slowly, almost dreamily. "She speaks to me still, through the hymns, through the light. She forgives me. She knows I did it for her. You didn't hear God." Luke said firmly. "You heard grief, and you gave it a pulpit." For a moment, Hale just stared, as though Luke had struck him. Then his hands began to shake violently. No. No, it was his voice. It had to be. Luke reached for his radio, but Hale's eyes flicked toward it. He took a step back, his body trembling like a coiled spring. "You can't stop it now, Deputy. The final cleansing is near. The fire will make all things pure again." "Hale, listen to me," Luke said steadily. "Put the madness down before it burns you too." But Hale's gaze had already shifted toward the window, toward the forest beyond the chapel. "You'll see," he whispered. "The light will come, and it will take me home." Then, with startling speed for a man his age, he bolted. He dashed past Luke, shoulder, slamming into him hard enough to stagger the deputy. "Reverend, stop!" Luke tore after him, but the old man was already running into the storm, black coat flapping behind him like wings of ash. Snow swallowed him whole. Luke stopped at the edge of the clearing, breathing heavily, gun drawn but useless in the whiteout. He listened. For footsteps, for prayer, for anything. Nothing. Just the wind howling through the trees. He stood there for a long moment, the cold biting through his uniform. Then he whispered, "He's going to do something terrible." When he returned to the sheriff's office, Clara was waiting. Her coat was dusted with snow, her face pale, but resolute. "You found him?" "I found him," Luke said grimly, "and I think he's planning to finish his work." "What do you mean?" "He said the fire would make all things pure again." Clara's hand flew to her mouth. "The church!" Luke nodded slowly. "If he thinks he's offering himself as a sacrifice, he'll go back there." Shadow, lying quietly near the heater, suddenly lifted his head. His ears pricked, a low growl rumbling in his throat as if confirming Luke's fear. The deputy knelt beside the dog. "You can feel it too, can't you? Something's coming." Shadow's tail thumped once, slow, deliberate, and his gaze turned toward the chapel hill, where smoke had not yet begun, but where destiny waited. Luke stood, slipping his badge back onto his coat. "If he wants to burn it all down," he said, voice low and firm, "then I'll be there to pull him out before he takes anyone else with him." Outside, the wind rose again, swirling flakes through the valley. The faint toll of the bell from the chapel drifted across the snow, 3 hollow rings that echoed like a warning. And as Luke looked toward the distant silhouette of the church against the gray horizon, he knew this night would end either in redemption or fire. The snow had thickened by nightfall, turning Hollow Creek into a world of silence and pale light. The storm rolled over the valley like a living thing, its breath cold and relentless. Deputy Luke Bennett stood in front of the sheriff's station, his radio pressed to his ear. The wind hissed, drowning out part of the transmission, but the words were enough to make his blood run cold. "Shadow's gone. Cage broken. Clara says he's missing." Luke cursed under his breath. "What do you mean, gone? How could a half-healed dog just disappear?" Static crackled. "Not alone," the voice replied faintly. "Somebody was seen near the clinic. Black coat. Looked like Reverend Hale." The world seemed to tilt beneath him. Luke slammed the radio back into its holster and sprinted for his truck. Snow whirled in dizzying spirals around him, but he barely felt the cold. Hale had vanished less than 12 hours earlier, and now the last innocent thing left in this town had been taken. He gunned the engine and tore down the road toward the chapel hill. The forest loomed ahead, dark and whispering. Every few seconds his headlights caught the reflection of falling snow and nothing else. But as he crested the ridge, his heart stopped. The chapel was alive again, but not with prayer. Flames licked through the broken windows, the cross above the door glowing red in the firelight. Smoke coiled up into the storm like black scripture written across the sky. Luke slammed the door open and ran into the storm. "Hale!" he shouted. "Stop this madness!" From within the inferno came a faint, distorted hymn. Then a voice answered, hoarse and cracked but eerily calm. "It's time, Deputy. The final offering. The beast must burn, and so must I." Luke pushed closer, shielding his face from the heat. Through the doorway, he could make out two shapes: the towering, hunched figure of Reverend Samuel Hale and the limp form of Shadow, bound near the altar with chains. The dog's muzzle was wrapped, his body trembling weakly. Hale's face gleamed in the firelight. His eyes were fever-bright, his hair disheveled, and his clerical coat half burned away. He looked like a man half consumed by his own faith. "You can't stop what's been written," he cried. "This creature bears the curse, Amelia's curse. I will free her soul tonight." Luke's voice broke through the roar of flames. "You're not freeing her, Hale. You're killing what's left of her love." Hale raised a trembling hand, clutching a syringe glinting in the firelight. "Mercy comes through pain," he whispered, "through surrender." Luke's instincts kicked in. He drew his revolver and aimed. "Drop it, now!" The Reverend smiled sadly, lowering the syringe, but in one motion he drove it into his own arm. He gasped, eyes rolling back. "No more sin. No more voices." Luke cursed and dove through the door as the roof groaned above, flames cascaded from the rafters. He tore the muzzle off Shadow, coughing as smoke filled his lungs. The German shepherd whimpered, tail twitching faintly. "Hold on, boy," Luke rasped, fumbling for the chain lock. The heat seared his gloves, the metal glowing red. He wrapped his coat around his hand and pulled until the link snapped. The dog collapsed into his arms, unconscious but alive. Behind him, Hale staggered to his knees, Bible clutched against his chest. "I see her," he murmured. "She's waiting for me in the light." Luke tried to reach him, shouting through the smoke. "Hale, come with me. You can still make this right." But the Reverend only smiled. "Go, deputy. Take the hound. The fire belongs to me." The floor cracked, flames bursting upward like a living thing. Luke threw his coat over Shadow and ran for the door, the fire snapping at his back. He barely made it through before the front beams collapsed with a roar. Outside, snowflakes melted as they hit the heat, turning to steam. Clara was already there, having followed the trail of smoke, her coat soaked through with snow. She ran toward him, eyes wide. "Luke, where is he?" Luke fell to his knees in the snow, clutching Shadow close. "He's gone," he said, voice shaking. "He stayed inside." Clara's hands flew to her mouth as the roof finally caved in. The cross at the top burned like a torch before crashing down into the flames. For a moment it looked as if the entire sky had caught fire. "Dear God," she whispered. Then she dropped beside Luke, reaching for the dog. "Shadow?" The German shepherd lay still in his arms, chest barely moving. Clara pressed her ear to his side, her breath catching. "He's fading. Luke, he's dying." Luke looked down at the animal that had survived hell twice and felt his throat tighten. "Not this time," he whispered. Clara's hands trembled as she began compressions, tears streaming down her soot-streaked face. "If there's a miracle left in this place, Lord," she whispered hoarsely, "don't take him too, please." Luke bowed his head beside her, murmuring under his breath. The two knelt together in the snow, praying over the broken creature between them. The fire behind them raged higher, the sound like thunder, the light flickering against their faces. Then, faintly, a sound broke through, the soft, wheezing breath of life. Clara gasped, eyes wide. "Luke, he's breathing!" Shadow's chest rose again, slow but steady. His paws twitched weakly, and a small sound escaped his throat, a whimper, a cry, and then silence again, but not the silence of death. Clara laughed through her tears, clutching Luke's arm. "He's alive," she said, almost in disbelief. Luke exhaled shakily, brushing the snow from the dog's muzzle. "You stubborn miracle," he murmured. Behind them, the church burned itself into memory. Flames devoured the last of the steeple, and as it fell, sparks rained down like stars over the snow. The wind shifted, carrying the smoke upward into the night until the fire's roar became a whisper and the sky glowed faintly gold. Clara leaned her head against Luke's shoulder, still holding the dog close. "It's over," she said softly. Luke looked at the smoldering ruins. "Yeah," he replied, voice quiet, heavy. "Maybe for him, maybe for all of us." For a long moment, they stayed there, 2 humans and 1 wounded soul, beneath the falling snow. The fire's warmth had faded, but somehow the cold didn't bite anymore. When the last embers died out, Luke whispered a single prayer, not for hail, not for vengeance, but for mercy. "May God forgive the lost," he said, "and bless the ones who found their way home." Snow began to fall again, soft and clean, covering the ashes. The valley was silent once more. A month had passed since the fire that had swallowed the old chapel, and Hollow Creek was slowly beginning to thaw from both the winter and its own fears. The snow had melted into thin rivers that ran through the dirt roads, reflecting the early spring sun. The ashes of the old church had been cleared away, and in its place rose a frame of fresh pine beams and new hope, the beginnings of a chapel reborn. Deputy Luke Bennett stood on the hill overlooking the site, his uniform jacket open, the crisp air brushing against his skin. His once stoic face now bore a quiet softness, a weariness mingled with peace. The sound of hammers and saws below was a song of rebuilding, not just of wood and nails, but of spirit. Beside him, Dr. Clara Hayes, now dressed in a beige wool coat and jeans tucked into mud-splattered boots, held 2 cups of coffee. Her brown hair was tied loosely, strands blowing in the breeze. She had been coming here almost every day since the fire, first to check on the survivors of the chaos, and then, simply, to be close to what she now called the Miracle Hill. She handed Luke one of the cups. "You never stop watching from up here," she said softly. "You'd think you built the place yourself." Luke smiled faintly. "I didn't build it. I just helped tear down what was wrong so something right could stand again." From below came the laughter of townsfolk, people who, weeks earlier, wouldn't even look Luke in the eye. There was old Jacob, the blind man who'd once spoken of cursed soil, now guiding children as they planted flowers along the church fence. The Petersons, who had once called for Shadow's death, now carried buckets of white paint. Even Pastor Miller, a newcomer to town, a gentleman in his early 40s with a calm voice and warm eyes, had volunteered to lead the new congregation. "Forgiveness," Clara said, watching them. "It's strange how it comes after the fire, like it burned the fear right out of them." Luke's eyes softened. Maybe that's how grace works. It has to hurt before it heals. A bark broke the silence. They both turned to see Shadow, the German shepherd who had once been branded a monster, trotting through the grass. His coat, once matted and burned, now gleamed under the sunlight, and the scars across his shoulder were fading beneath new fur. His gait was steady again, proud, the kind of walk that carried purpose. "Looks like someone's back to his old self," Clara smiled, crouching as Shadow came to nuzzle her hand. Luke knelt beside her, rubbing the dog's neck gently. "He's tougher than both of us put together," he murmured. "Guess heaven wasn't ready for him yet." Shadow looked up at them with warm, amber eyes, eyes that once reflected pain and distrust, now filled with something softer, peace. He turned his gaze toward the new chapel, where workers lifted the wooden cross onto the steeple. The sun caught it at just the right angle, and for a moment the reflection shimmered like a star. Luke stood and watched, his throat tightening. "You know," he said, voice quiet, "when I found him on that cross, I thought maybe the town had lost its soul, but now, it's like he brought it back." Clara looked up at him, her expression tender. "You don't realize it, do you? You didn't just save a dog, Luke. You saved everyone who forgot what kindness looked like." Luke chuckled softly. "Guess I had some help." Clara smiled and brushed her gloved fingers along Shadow's muzzle. "He's not just any dog," she said. "He's Hollow Creek's redemption story." The sound of a guitar strumming drifted from below. A small group of townsfolk had gathered near the half-finished steps of the chapel singing softly, hymns of forgiveness and faith. Pastor Miller waved at Luke, calling out, "Sheriff, we'd be honored if you'd join the blessing." Luke hesitated, not used to being called sheriff with such warmth. Then Clara nudged him gently. "Go on. It's your hill, too." Luke glanced at Shadow. "You coming, partner?" The dog barked once, loud and clear, then bounded ahead down the hill, tail wagging. Clara laughed, following after them. Together, the three of them descended into the heart of Hollow Creek, where the townspeople gathered not as victims of fear, but as believers in renewal. Pastor Miller raised his hands. "Let us thank the Lord," he began, "for bringing light where there was darkness, and for reminding us that mercy sometimes comes with 4 paws." The crowd chuckled softly. Shadow sat at Luke's feet, ears perked as if listening to every word. Clara rested her hand on Luke's arm, her touch lingering just a second longer than before. When the prayers ended, people came forward one by one, some to shake Luke's hand, others to pat Shadow's head, whispering apologies and blessings. The same children who once threw stones now offered him flowers. Shadow accepted each gesture calmly, his tail swaying like a slow, rhythmic metronome of grace. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the new chapel's bell was raised for the first time. It wasn't yet ready to ring, but its bronze surface caught the evening light, a symbol of things mended, not forgotten. Luke and Clara sat together on the steps, watching as the last workers packed up. The town felt different, softer, warmer, alive. Clara leaned her shoulder against his. "So, what now, Deputy Bennett?" Luke chuckled. "Maybe. Less deputy, more living." "And Shadow?" He looked at the dog, now dozing at their feet. "He stays. He's part of the team now. Family." Clara smiled. "Then maybe Hollow Creek finally has its peace." Luke nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Peace. And maybe a bit of heaven. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers from the valley below. Somewhere in the distance, the rebuilt cross gleamed under the last light of day. No longer a symbol of suffering, but of survival. And as the sky deepened into twilight, Shadow lifted his head, staring toward the chapel. His ears twitched, and for a moment it almost looked as though he was listening to something only he could hear. A whisper of faith, a memory of a little girl's laughter, a voice finally at rest. Luke placed a hand on his head. "We made it, boy," he said softly. "We all did." The chapel bell swayed gently in the evening breeze, silent but alive, waiting for the day it would sing again. The dawn of the dedication day arrived crisp and golden, spreading a veil of light across Hollow Creek. Frost still clung to the rooftops, glinting like powdered glass, but the air carried warmth, not from weather, but from forgiveness. The newly built chapel stood proud and white, its cross gleaming in the sun. Bells were strung above the entrance, waiting to ring for the first time in years. Deputy Luke Bennett, now dressed in his formal Navy uniform with a freshly polished badge, stood at the chapel doors, watching people gather. His face, once marked by exhaustion and grief, seemed lighter. The hard lines around his eyes had softened, replaced with something rarer. Peace. Children in wool coats ran past him, holding small bouquets of wildflowers. Women in church dresses and knitted shawls arranged candles along the pews, while men finished setting up benches outside for those who couldn't fit inside. It felt like the entire town had come, not out of duty, but gratitude. From behind him, a familiar voice spoke. "You clean up well, Deputy," said Dr. Clara Hayes, stepping beside him with her hair loosely curled and a soft ivory scarf around her neck. Her brown eyes reflected the morning sun. Luke smiled, adjusting his tie. "You too, Doc? Didn't think I'd live to see the day you traded your scrubs for Sunday best?" She chuckled. "Don't get used to it. I'm still better with blood than fashion." Before Luke could reply, a bark echoed from the chapel steps. Everyone turned. Shadow, the once accused, cursed dog, walked slowly toward the crowd. The German shepherd's coat glistened under the sunlight, healed and strong again. Round his neck hung a simple leather collar engraved with a small silver tag. Shadow, Faith's guardian. The crowd went silent. a collective moment of reverence. Even the children froze, their eyes wide. Then, from the back, little Annie Harper, a freckled 7-year-old in a blue dress, took a hesitant step forward. Her family had once thrown stones at Shadow. Now she approached with trembling hands, whispering, "Hi, boy." Shadow paused, amber eyes steady, then lowered his head gently, allowing her to touch his fur. Annie giggled in relief, her fingers curling through his thick coat. The sound of her laughter broke the stillness, and suddenly the entire square erupted in applause and tears. "See?" Clara whispered beside Luke. "Even the children remember what forgiveness feels like." The church bell chimed, its first note pure and trembling. The townsfolk filed inside for the ceremony. Pastor Miller, standing behind the pulpit, raised his hands for silence. He was a man in his early 40s, with kind eyes and a quiet, steady presence, wearing a simple gray robe. "My friends," he began, "today is not just the rebirth of our chapel, but the rebirth of faith. Faith in each other and in the unseen ways God works through His creations." He nodded, toward Luke and Clara, then down at Shadow, who sat obediently by Luke's side. "We were blind once," he continued, "led by fear instead of understanding. But sometimes God sends help in forms we least expect, not in thunder or angels with wings, but in a loyal heart wrapped in fur." The congregation murmured in agreement. Luke felt Clara's hand brush against his, a quiet reassurance, a shared memory of the night when everything nearly burned away. When Pastor Miller finished, he gestured toward Luke. "Deputy Bennett has something to say." Luke hesitated for a moment, feeling the eyes of the entire town upon him. He stepped forward, boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. "When I first found Shadow," he began, "he was hanging from a cross, beaten, bleeding, and barely alive. And I'll admit, part of me believed what the town said, that maybe he was cursed, that maybe God had turned his face from this place." He paused, looking out at the people. Faces that once turned away from him, now filled with remorse and hope. "But I was wrong," he continued. "We all were. God didn't send a curse. He sent a protector. He sent this dog to remind us what courage looks like, what forgiveness feels like, and how far grace can reach, even through fur and scars." The crowd grew silent again. Only the faint crackle of candles filled the air. "Shadow didn't just survive," Luke said softly. "He saved lives. He found the truth. He stood between us and our own darkness. And maybe that's what faith really is, not waiting for miracles from above, but seeing them walking right beside us." A murmur of emotion rippled through the room. Pastor Miller bowed his head, eyes glistening. Clara's fingers tightened gently around Luke's sleeve. When Luke stepped back, Shadow rose to his feet and padded forward, stopping in the middle of the aisle. The sunlight, filtered through the stained glass window, fell across his back, a cascade of gold and crimson that looked almost like a halo. Gasps echoed softly through the congregation. "Look," whispered one of the women, "it's like he's glowing." Luke smiled faintly. "He's not glowing," he said. "That's just light finding where it belongs." After the final prayer, the townsfolk stepped outside. The sky had cleared completely, painted in soft hues of morning gold. Birds sang in the trees around the new chapel, their voices blending with the gentle toll of the bell. Shadow walked ahead, tail wagging, and the children followed him, laughing, playing, no longer afraid. He turned once to glance back at Luke and Clara, then bounded toward the hill where wildflowers were blooming through the snow. Clara leaned against Luke's shoulder. "He's happy." Luke nodded slowly. "He's free." They stood together, watching the sunlight spill across the valley. The town of Hollow Creek, once haunted by fear, now shone with quiet redemption. Luke tilted his head toward the sky. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for saving more than just a dog." The wind stirred gently, carrying the chapel bell's echo through the hills. Shadow barked once, a sharp, joyful sound, then ran into the field, chasing the light as though he were part of it. The people watched him go, not with superstition, but with awe. The kind that makes you believe that miracles still happen, that love still conquers, and that sometimes heaven sends its messengers on 4 legs. Sometimes God's miracles don't arrive in shining lights or angelic voices from the heavens. Sometimes they walk beside us on 4 legs, carrying scars, loyalty, and a love so pure it can heal even the darkest heart. Shadow was more than a dog. He was a reminder that faith is not about seeing miracles, but believing in them even when the world has turned its back. Through his pain and courage, an entire town found redemption, compassion, and the strength to forgive. In our own lives, we often pass by those who are wounded, people, animals, even ourselves, and call them cursed, when in truth, they may be the very miracles God has sent to lead us back to light. So, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe that God still works through love, loyalty, and second chances, type Amen in the comments. May the Lord bless everyone who watches this story. May He open our eyes to the quiet miracles walking among us every day, and may His grace guide your heart, your home, and your faith always. Subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, kindness, and the miracles that remind us God never stops working.